Welcome to the Point. As the dust begins to settle in Lansing, and maybe not fully settle, the budget is done and there is a lot in it. We're going to talk to a Senate appropriator today, Senator Mark Huizenga from Walker. Thank you very much for joining us. We've talked about this process before, and when I said the dust is settled, the budget is done. But as you pointed out just before we went on, at 1,100 pages, nobody has had a chance to see everything that's in it, including the governor, who's going to have to sign off on it. She has the ability to make some changes. So we're talking about a largely done process, but it's not completely done. Welcome to the show, and let's just talk, first of all, a little bit about the process. We know it's a new place. 40 years since Democrats have controlled all the levers. You're one of those guys who has navigated and tried to work within that system, but how much different has it been when it comes to budgeting for you to get things done this year versus your previous budget serving in the majority?
Yeah, I'm not going to say better or worse. I'm going to say different because, when the Democrats have their priorities, a lot of those just simply don't align ideologically to Republicans. I think myself as a centrist, the one who goes to Lansing to get things done, we can always find common ground. And I'm proud to say that we did that in this budget. A lot of the things that I asked for, we took a strong evidence-based approach to. We shared that with the leaders of the Appropriations Committee and the majority leader and the minority leader, and they advocated for things that are good for our state. And that is our job, Rick, to make sure that we get things done for the state, that we spend taxpayer dollars wisely, and that we work for our people.
One of the things that calls to mind is a ceremony recently over at the Ford Museum, laying the wreath on the grave of the president for his 110th, what would have been his 110th birthday, and talking with a couple of his kids about how politics used to look and how people worked together, how Jerry Ford and Tip O'Neill worked together, and Carl Albert and others. And in Lansing, it has not been as divisive, I don't think, as Washington, but there certainly has been that element of this is ours, this is where we are, and the minority need not apply. And I think that was true when Republicans were in charge, and I think it's true to some degree with Democrats in charge. How do you get there? You just described what you want to do. How do you get there?
Yeah, so politics is just that. And what you described is what I call the politics of politics. And it's finding ways to jockey and work across the aisle, to have those conversations not on the floor, but to meet with people, talk about issues that are really important to you, and give a data-driven response to it. So I told you earlier, I put together a list of my requests, things that are all good for the people of the state of Michigan and good for our community here. I put a spreadsheet together. I took all the values of what was important, what the project was, how it would be impacting our community, and what the cost was. Included source documents. It read like a college thesis. And we got a lot of those things because we took that strong bipartisan centrist perspective.
Well, one of the House members on the night of passage was standing just in front of me and speaking to the chamber and said, look, I saw some of the previous budgets. It could have been a lot worse.
Yeah.
But he also concluded it could have been a lot better, and you have to work together to get there. So with that as a backdrop, knowing that you put on your scholarly hat and tried the approach of trying to explain why you wanted these appropriations, one of them that you talked about that may come as somewhat of a surprise to people who are viewing is you advocated for and got over $20 million?
Yeah, $25.8 million to support crime victims. This is for human trafficking, domestic abuse, sexual violence, things that if you're not in that business, if you're the average American, you probably don't experience that. But having been in the House and now the Senate, I've heard countless hearings that talk about what the impact is for society, to children, to young women. I had a meeting earlier this year, and I met with these folks, and I couldn't remember their name off the top of my head, so I Google searched women's shelters. And if you do that, Kent County has quite a few of them. That really is a pretty good indication that there's a problem here. The real issue is that VOCA funds, dollars that come from federal situations where they have to release funds to the particular organization, those are unpredictable. And so I said, let's make sure we do this the right way. And in the DHHS committee, which I also sit on, we asked for that there. There was an additional dollars that they put in there, but an additional $25 million, that makes a real difference for the people in our state. for those that are disenfranchised, and can actually really, really make a difference for what people are asking for.
And you make a point that I don't think can be overemphasized. We don't know what that life is like.
Right.
Because that's not part of our everyday life. But for those people in that situation, they don't have they don't have other opportunities. So this will be something that's statewide.
Yeah. Well, and I talked to one of my Democrat colleagues and I said, thank you for your support for this project because I think it's great for our entire state. This is good for women, for society. And she said, you know, Mark, it's good that you did this not only as a Republican, probably not typically what you'd expect, but as a man, that you're standing up for women who are in crises. She said, that's different. So I was really proud to stand up. I hadn't really thought about it that way, but.
Well, one of the things is, and you have a sheet here highlighting what are some of the other things that you see as Republican priorities that ended up being successes in this budget?
You know, I think fiscal conservatives will always look towards reduction in debt. And in this budget, we saw an $800 million reserve for debt payments, $200 million towards the state education retirement debt. These are promises that are made by people before us, and it's our obligation to fulfill that. We did the same thing when I was mayor of the city of Walker. Pension, OPEB obligations, those are not sexy things to vote on, but that's the responsible thing that people sent us to Lansing to do, and to be responsible with it. And so I'm happy to support that. Funding for schools for more resource officers, $450 per pupil increase to K-12, that's really big. $250 million to repair the local bridges and roads, that's important to all of us. And over $500 million to drinking water and wastewater improvements, as well as improvements to state parks. Those are things that all of us can get behind, and those are really statewide Republican priorities that our caucus stood for and we got. And so when we talk about what the compromise process looks like, this shows that it does work. Now, objectively, you may not feel like you won, but these are all good things that I'm proud to say we got.
Well, in talking with Senator Bumstead, who is the lead on the budget for you guys in the Senate, the day that this was finally settled, he said, look, we did some Republican things. We paid down debt. We made investment in infrastructure and also, I think, in parks and some of those kind of things. And he said, of course, we didn't get everything we wanted. We don't hold the gavel anymore.
Right.
So you get what you can. Talk to me about one other area, because I think there were two or three here that, and you enumerated them, but when you talk about the $800 million to pay down debt, is that money that goes into the strategic or the rainy day fund?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, so that's another big chunk in there that has grown since after the recession in the mid-2000s when it was non-existent to now when there's a fair amount of money there.
I was just at a meeting this week called the Council of State Governments, where they talked about different performance metrics. And it's always interesting when you're in the bubble of Michigan, what's going on, is it good or bad? They actually did some benchmarking of other Midwest states to say, how are we doing? And Michigan's doing pretty well in investing for the long-term rainy day funds, because Murphy's Law, it'll happen at some point in time and we have to be prepared for it. And they showed that we were slightly ahead of Indiana, slightly ahead of Ohio, and dramatically ahead of Illinois. So when we look at Great Lakes states and seeing those benchmarks, we should all be proud of those kind of numbers that we're anticipating, and we're being the adults in the room.
You have the ability and the benefit of being able to kind of take dollars out of certain budgets and kind of know how those are going to be used. For those of us who don't spend hours and hours and hours in the budget process, we look at kind of the top line, if you will, which is what I have here. This is a House fiscal analysis of the conference report that was ultimately approved. And as big as these numbers are, I shouldn't need my glasses, but I do, because there are a lot of them. And some of the ones that jump out at me, and this is always the case, Health and Human Services, $35 billion, almost $36 billion. Tell people what that's for, because a lot of that is federal pass-through money that is dedicated no matter what you say or do.
Yeah, absolutely. So those are the dollars. A lot of that is federal dollars that come to the states. Each state is the one that is responsible for operationalizing Medicaid. So those are the dollars that people in crisis, those without insurance, those that are in the hospital and for some reason don't have coverage. It's a lot of the different programs. The sexual abuse, domestic violence was in there too, but that's like $4 million. We put 25 additional million towards that. So think about this as the backbone of health for our state. Things that might be included in there are dollars to help train physicians. These are all really important things. Most people don't get too excited about DHHS because they know that this is a pretty solid program.
Yeah, and I would point out that if these numbers are correct, and I expect them to be, out of that $35.7 billion, there's only about $6.5 billion that comes out of Michigan taxpayer monies directly. Now, understanding that they pay federal taxes too, and those are dollars coming back. But out of the general fund, general purpose, about $6.5 billion. So the bulk of that is federal money.
And you might be surprised to know that in a lot of these budget categories, state dollars have to be leveraged to obtain federal dollars. So it's a little bit, you spend it sometimes maybe not what you would want to, but you get a lot more in return.
Yeah, sometimes you can spend $1 and get $5 from the federal government, and if you don't spend it, you don't get it. So it's kind of a multiplier effect. We've got about a minute left in this segment. There's a whole lot more we want to talk about. I want to go over one more budget quickly because I know that you're close to this, and that's the corrections budget. I talked with the director of the Department of Corrections this week, Heidi Washington, and their budget didn't increase dramatically. It's been around $2 billion for years, but it did go up a little bit. Their census has gone down over the past few years. But one of the things they're doing I found interesting is $7 million for body cams. That was a priority of theirs, and they're going in. These are some of the places where the money goes that people might say, well, that's a lot of money. On the other hand, it might protect both prisoners and guards and other workers there. Are those the kind of investments we ought to be making?
Yeah, you know, if you think about it, transparency in government is really important. When I talk to folks, say, look, you can watch us on TV and see how we're voting. You can look at the record and see how we voted on every single item. And having transparency for those that are incarcerated is important too.
We've got a lot more to talk about. It's an almost $82 billion budget, and we've started to scratch the surface. My guest is Senator Mark Huizenga. He will be with us for the remainder of the show as we talk about the process that was kind of new, different, as he explained it. And we'll also talk about a remarkable first 6 months of the session when we come back to the point. Welcome back to the Point. Senator Mark Huizenga is with us. You're an appropriator. He served in the Senate, but you previously served in the House. You were the mayor of Walker. You're no stranger to budgeting. You're familiar with these numbers. We were talking about the Department of Corrections before we left off, and I want to just mention one more thing. You were kind enough to invite me to a graduation out at the Hamling Correctional Facility where I think about 3 years worth of classes that had gone through the Calvin University program for inmates who are getting an associate's degree or a bachelor's degree, a number of different things. I also talked with Director Washington about that, and all of those different programs, including programs in our prison system that teach people skilled trades. There's more money in this budget for all of those things that goes to the core of corrections, not just incarceration. I would think most lawmakers would have been in favor of that.
Yeah, and you know, I think that when we talk about the Department of Corrections, I think when we look at these educational tools, that we're actually really seeing corrections occurring. Changing the trajectory of a family from those that's incarcerated is important because the recidivism is what's caused so much decline in problems for society. I was very excited to get money in the state budget a number of years ago to help Calvin expand that program. They hosted an event this spring where they had schools from around our entire state as well as some from out of state to say, hey, this is best practice. The Department of Education, the U.S. Department of Education said this is best practices. How do we learn from that? So that conference was actually funded by part of that grant there. 12 schools signed a compact that said, we want to do this. So when we see that, we know that there's real enthusiasm. And those are the kind of dollars, let's assume, Rick, that you don't care about people. Well, the return on investment for the state for the quelling of the violence in the prison, that alone is worth the dollars right there. But changing people's lives, that's what government's supposed to do, and I'm really, really proud to stand up and support that.
Yeah, I can't spend too much time on this, but during an event in Kalamazoo, they had a young man who had, as he put it, a bad night and got involved in the system somehow, but he was being helped by loosening rules on keeping in touch with parole officers and having a job fair and getting instruction and getting a job, which many experts say is the key to getting people out of the system. So some of the things that the money are going for. Let's talk about a big one. And this is one where I don't think Republicans and Democrats, and certainly not Republicans and the governor, have seen eye to eye. Transportation, $6.6 billion. Governor ran on fixing the roads. You, on your way over here, experienced construction today. I experience it every time I take a turn. I've seen more of Grand Rapids this year than I have in the 30 years I've lived here because I've been driving back roads because everything's under construction. Are we making progress, or are we just treading water when it comes to that?
I think we are making progress, but the formula is complex. Act 51 dollars goes from 1951.
Yeah, the Act 51 of 1951.
The formula is it basically shares dollars between the state using federal dollars. Most people don't know this, but the dollars for a hybrid or electric vehicle, your cost of your registration is higher. The registration versus the tax at the pump, it's about 50-50. So some people get upset and say, wait a minute, I'm buying an electric car, but they're also not contributing to society to make sure that the roads are in good condition. I think the real problem, Rick, is going to be in the long term on the federal side because there is no registration for gas versus an electric. And when we see the rate of federal gas tax being relatively stagnant and not seeing that as we move towards more efficient vehicles and electrics and hybrids, that's going to be more problematic. There have been several reports out. Every year there's a report that talks about the challenges. I think probably the biggest problem we face right now is the higher cost of construction and materials.
One of the things, and this is budget related, it's not something that's being done now, but it's something that people were talking about going back to the Engler days and certainly during the Snyder administration. But nobody wants to change that formula. It's the formula sets out a certain amount of money for federal roads, some money that is for public transportation. I mean, it's a very clear formula. But one of the things that has been talked about is moving away from that, or at least a pilot program, that would charge by the mile, not by the gallon. Is that something that's going to become a topic of conversation in Lansing? And when it does, are there going to be privacy concerns about that?
Absolutely, and I think that's a real problem. States all over the country talk about this idea. No one's done it because then how do you share that information across all these states? There's huge privacy issues. You can opt out of almost anything from the do not call list to HIPAA privacy in healthcare. I think it's unlikely that Michiganders and American citizens are going to want to say, hey, let's just give this information to the government. Who's going to cook the books? What's going to be right or wrong? The real issue is going to be top-line revenue, how we get more dollars into that. No one wants to pay more dollars for roads, but that's probably going to be the answer in the long run.
You talked about getting more resource officers into school, but there's a lot of extra things going into schools. At 21, this, by the way, is from the Senate fiscal analysis of the conference report on the school, or the school buses, it's euphemistically called, $21.5 billion, essentially. Largest, I should point out that all of this is the largest budgets collectively, almost $81.6 billion, something like that. Are we hitting the mark on schools? Because we've seen those dollars increase pretty dramatically in the past 5 years. And there are any number of studies that show that Michigan schools are not keeping pace. Testing numbers, reading numbers, all of those kind of things. And I think there are many people, I have kids in public schools. So when I look at it, I'm like, okay, what do you do? I mean, and I should, as a side, say we're very pleased and the progress has been good. We're in a school district where they, they've kind of harnessed the ability to be able to meet those metrics. But is this kind of money going to bring some schools that we know are struggling up to where they need to be?
I think it's an issue of fairness, making sure that the dollars go to schools across the state the same way. And one thing that I've advocated for, but we haven't seen in this budget, is how do we target inspirational leaders? Principals and superintendents, a lot of those folks are getting older. And who do you know that says, I want to be a superintendent? We know that the culture is set at the top. And when you've got a great principal or a great superintendent, it's almost palpable when you walk in the door. You can feel that there's a great education going on. And so I've been advocating for more dollars to help find good ways to get better educators that way. I also think that we know that the knowledge gaps are being identified better through data now, through NWA programs where you can see the test scores, you can find out where the teachers went to school, and then that feedback loop to go back to the universities to say, here's where your deficiencies are, here's what's working. We are going to continue to hone this. The children are our future, and happy to support education, of course. It's going to drive all of us in the future.
One of the reasons I wanted to have you come in here is because you described yourself as a centrist. And while I was in the chambers, both this kind of running back and forth between the Senate and the House, as these bills came together, as the conference report was being finally hammered out. The one thing that was clear is Republicans didn't know what was in the budget. Democrats didn't know what was in the budget. Some of those folks in those quadrant meetings, or some of the folks that were, making those decisions, knew some of what was in there. But at 1,100 pages that was cranked out overnight or whenever they did it, it's hard to know. That's not new. That happens. Is there a better way to do budgeting so people really know what they're voting on? I mean, at the end of the day, with a $9 billion surplus, the optics on not approving a budget would have been awful.
Yeah.
But if you don't know how you spent that $9 billion, that's a little scary too.
Yeah, well, I'll just say one thing is that when we do the budgets through the committee process, we have an idea of where we're going there, but we could expand that certainly and talk better about that, what that process looks like. For the viewers, the governor gives a recommendation in February. Committees meet both in the House and the Senate independently of each other, and then they come together in the spring and reconcile the differences between the House, the Senate, and the governor's office. So there's 3 pieces of complex legislation. The governor didn't get everything she wanted, the House didn't get everything they wanted, the Senate didn't get everything they wanted. How do you distill that into a process that's going to be more transparent? I think everybody would want that. I just don't think that's how it works anywhere, though. I'd love to see an improvement. I don't know what that would look like. I'm sure if you talk to our federal counterparts, they would say, take that times 100, and it's that much worse.
Well, yeah, and I can't recall the last time they did a budget in regular order. So, I mean, at least to the credit of the folks in Michigan, every year you do turn out a budget. And I would say for maybe only the second time since the law was passed, you got it done by the July 1st deadline. So, I mean, there are some positives to look at in here. A couple of quick things in the 2 minutes we have left. There's $9 billion of surplus money, and there's one-time money that's left in here. Are you confident that that money was spent in such a way that the state is not going to be obligated for future dollars for projects, that one-time money was spent one time and it doesn't keep the state on the hook for financing down the road?
Yeah, I think if you look at especially the priorities that I got in there, we see one-time things like Exalta Health, where they provide health to those without coverage, with those that are refugees, those that are immigrants. It's on division. It's actually not in my district, but it's good for our community. The Kelvin Masters of Public Health program, that's a really important one. Providing programs for the John Ball Zoo. Those are all things that really build strong communities, and Grand Rapids is the envy of the state. Why do you guys have such growth? It's putting these kind of dollars into programs that are both social, structural, like the amphitheater or the Fruit Ridge Bridge, which I was proud to support earlier this year. All these things work together. It's never just one thing. And so to answer your question, it's never perfect when you say one-time funding or not, but I have a pretty good understanding that the work that I've done will be sustainable and will help our organizations in our communities.
And finally, I want to talk about the budget as a whole. If you strip out that $9 billion and assume that that is the base going forward, and we're really short on time, and I apologize for that. Are these spending levels minus the $9 billion going to be sustainable going forward, given some of the revenue projections we've already heard?
Yeah, it's uncertain because when people ask, where does this extra money come from? Well, things cost more, so that means our sales tax is going to go up. Sales tax goes right into the funds. What about income tax? People's wages are going up, so consequently their taxes are going up. The one thing I wish we'd have done more is to try and find ways to get tax relief for Michiganders. We didn't do that. We got an incremental amount. I hope we can keep that. But I'll always advocate for responsible spending.
Senator, as always, I appreciate your time coming in and trying to make some sense out of a complex budget. We'll have some of your colleagues come in the weeks to come and talk more about that, but thank you for your time, and I'll be right back after this. Thanks for watching this week. Join me next week when we have 2 House appropriators, 1 Republican, 1 Democrat, on to talk about their take on the budget as you join us every week. To the point.